From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Tuesday, February 6th. The Albanese government has finally released its plans to curb motor vehicle pollution. This is crucial for the government as Labor won the 2022 election on a promise of climate policy reforms. But the proposal also puts a spotlight on just how behind Australia is on reducing carbon emissions. We're reportedly the last developed country, other than Russia, to impose pollution caps on motor vehicles. So why are we so behind? And what will it take for the Labor government to successfully legislate its policy? Today, climate and energy correspondent Mike Foley on what this new plan will mean for drivers, and how much opposition Labor is facing on a policy that is arguably central to its hold on power. So, Mike, over the weekend, the Albanese government announced a new preferred model for mandatory pollution caps, and that's going to be applied to all new cars. So why is the government deciding to do this now?
G'day, Sam. It's a crucial part of the government's climate policy. So the Albanese government legislated that it would achieve net zero emissions by 2050, and it also said that we'll cut greenhouse gases 43% by 2030. And obviously the cars on roads, trucks on roads generate a fair whack of the pollution going into the atmosphere from Australia, like every country around the world. So it's now unveiled for the first time the detail of its key mechanism to get the cars on Australia's roads cleaner.
Governments for years have talked about fixing this. It's time that a government actually fixed it.
And also as part of that, cleaning up the emissions from cars, it's going to encourage EVs, electric vehicles, onto our roads, which, as we all know, create zero transport emissions as they're tootling around.
Whether it's diesel, whether it's hybrids or whether it's electric vehicles, that we are getting into the Australian market the most efficient vehicle.
The government is also selling the policy. It's doing the retail business of politics by saying to voters that by forcing manufacturers to sell cleaner cars, they'll use less fuel, and the government makes some might say ambitious claim that the average driver will be saving about $1,000 a year on their fuel bill.
To make really substantial savings on the amount of money we spend on fuel. So
we'll dig into that over the coming days, I'm sure, and find out if that checks out. But they're promising a big saving in your average fuel bill to sweeten the deal.
Okay, so can you tell us the details of the fuel efficiency standard that the government is proposing, and what exactly are pollution caps, and how is this going to impact us?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a mouthful. But for a simple person like me, what it means is that every car maker in Australia has been told that once the government's legislation goes through Parliament, they will have an overall budget for the amount of pollution that can come out of the entire fleet of their cars that are sold into Australia. So every car manufacturer has to have a view onto how many cleaner cars they've got that are sold into Australia and how much room they make in their emissions budget if they're going to sell dirtier, higher polluting cars. That might be a powerful muscle car, it might be a big four-wheel drive or a heavy ute. So it's saying each year there has to be an emissions budget on all the cars that are sold into Australia by a manufacturer. There's a finite limit, and it's up to the manufacturer to manage how they reach that limit. Some manufacturers might like to try to sell a whole lot of electric vehicles, don't create any pollution at all, and that gives them room to also sell some higher polluting cars and then still stay underneath their budget. They might like to target selling quite efficient petrol vehicles that are all down below the pollution standards, so they're still not exceeding their budget even though they don't sell EVs. The government is very keen to stress that they're not banning any model whatsoever. Manufacturers are free to sell whatever models they like, be it high polluting cars, be it EVs, but their policy will drive an overall fuel efficiency through the market, and Australia will effectively drop the volume of emissions that it creates from the vehicles on its roads.
And so when will this actually come into effect?
The government is planning to legislate this change as soon as possible. They're hoping for it to kick off in 2025 at the start of next year. There's a bit of wrangling to go through Parliament. It's all very early days, Sam. We don't know if the opposition will support the legislation through Parliament. We don't know what the Greens will say. But the fair guess at the moment is that the opposition will try to block it, but the government will be able to get enough votes in the lower house and, crucially, the Senate.
And so, not surprisingly, Labor's plan has, of course, led to a stoush with the coalition. So can you tell me, what is the coalition so upset about? Because on the face of it, this policy sounds really positive. It's going to help tackle climate change. It's going to give consumers more choice about what vehicles they can buy. Labor has said it's going to reduce the price of petrol. So what's happening here?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's where the political bun fight will go to now, Sam. And what the coalition has claimed is that manufacturers will charge more for some cars.
The ministers are saying it's not going to impact the cost of purchasing a car. It will.
They're centring their claims on heavy polluting vehicles like utes and large off-road four-wheel drives, saying that there'll be some sort of cost impost waged on those cars.
It will impact the choice of cars available, because 2/3 of the cars that are purchased last year by Australians are SUVs, four-wheel drives and utes.
To make them less popular potentially, or because they'll become harder for manufacturers to move, they won't sell as often, so therefore they'll be charging more because there's not that economy of scale when they import them into Australia.
This policy is asking Australians to change fundamentally who they are and how they think about their relationship with their car.
It's quite unclear. There's no detail yet as to precisely why the coalition says that utes will cost more, but that is the claim. We have seen all of this before. We saw this play out almost exactly the same in 2017 when a former coalition treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, introduced a pretty detailed policy proposal to introduce a fuel efficiency standard, but they backed down. Car makers' representatives said that costs of vehicles could go up $5,000. We don't know how the coalition will react, and that's going to be a key thing to watch in coming days and weeks.
We'll be right back. So, Mike, I want to explore a little bit more just how the coalition has approached this in the past. For example, what did former Prime Minister Scott Morrison say about electric vehicles?
End the weekend, Sam. That was the claim. He had a great soundbite when Bill Shorten had some policy measures. That was the 2019 federal election. And in the lead up to that, Scott Morrison insinuated that Bill Shorten was effectively forcing the choice of EVs onto Australian motorists.
And I'll tell you what, it's not going to tow your trailer, it's not going to tow your boat, it's not going to get you out to your favourite camping spot with your family. Bill Shorten wants to end the weekend.
That didn't play out very well for Scott Morrison. It polled very poorly. It made the coalition look a bit retrograde and a bit backward-looking in a lot of voters' minds. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see how the coalition approaches a potential scare campaign if they decide to follow through with one this time around. But at the moment, the indication is that they're picking up on warnings from one industry body, the Federated Chamber of Automotive Industries, who have said that the cost of vehicles may rise. The day that claim was made, the coalition had picked up on it and centred squarely on utes. And the interesting thing about that is that a lot of the polling data shows that tradies and people in the mortgage belt are still, as they have for a long time, been the group of swinging voters that political parties like to target to try to get enough seats to form another government. With the likely federal election in 2025, there'll be a laser focus on tradies and their utes. And it's now up to Chris Bowen and Catherine King to make the argument that they're not touching anyone's ute, but they're just giving you more choice. That will be their argument. And we're expecting there'll be some sort of claim from the coalition that costs will rocket up for ute buyers who will be left with less choice and more costly vehicles.
I mean, this would have to arguably be one of the most Australian opposing ideas to any sort of policy change, which is like, what about our utes?
Yeah, it's exactly. There's good retail politics in it here. There's also good retail politics on the side of Labor. A lot of people love the idea, even tradies, of saving on fuel. So if Labor is saying we're siding with motorists and forcing car makers to sell you vehicles that are cheaper to run, and they can convince them of their claims that the cost of vehicles won't rise significantly, that could be a big winner at the ballot box for the government.
And so what about car manufacturers themselves? How have they responded?
The responses are starting to come through. The car makers who are focused on growing electric vehicle sales are really happy with this move. So that's Hyundai, Polestar, who's the electric vehicle arm of Volvo. Tesla, of course, will be happy with this. It's no mystery that Toyota will be quite concerned. We'll see what they say in coming days, but Toyota have the smallest number of electric vehicles in development of the major global car brands. So they're quite sceptical of countries that introduce policies to really ramp up EV sales. Who else comes out of the woodwork to oppose it, though? That's one to watch in coming days.
And so, Mike, I wanted to ask you, how is this going to likely impact our transition to electric vehicles? And how can Labor actually move forward on this?
This is crucial for them. They need every sector of the economy reducing their emissions rapidly. Their climate targets are not just important to meet voter expectations, they're really important on the international front with the Biden administration in the US, for example, the European Union, key trading partners, reducing emissions a bit quicker than Australia, and they've got ambitious goals to continue doing that into the future. Australia really feels the pressure to keep faith with that movement. There's a complicating factor for cars, Sam, where if the average vehicle life in Australia is 15 years or more, we keep our cars on the road for a long time. That means that you have to be selling a hell of a lot of EVs by 2035 if we're going to meet net zero emissions by 2050. That's because you don't want too many petrol cars being sold from 2035 onwards, still driving around on the road in 2044, creating emissions, driving Australia's greenhouse budget up while we're only got a certain number of years to get net zero. So we need all those petrol cars off the road by then. So the government really needs to ramp up rapidly EV sales to have a shake at meeting its climate goals.
And Mike, as you've reported, Australia is the last developed country, apart from Russia, to impose pollution caps on motor vehicles. Now, that really shocked me. Why are we so behind?
Well, we have effective scare campaigns, Sam. I think that's the long and the short of it, really. We are, in terms of efficient motor vehicles, we are a global pariah. That's fair to say. The average vehicle emissions in Australia calculates out at 170 grams per kilometre travelled. That's high. That's 20% higher in the US. The US has had a fuel efficiency standard for half a century, since the 1970s.
Wow.
And it's nearly half, like it's 40% higher than in the European Union, that also have some pretty stringent pollution caps. So we have really dirty vehicles chugging around. And there's a fear that, well-founded fear, I think it's fair to say, that the longer we have a market that has no pollution caps on cars, the more likely we are to be a dumping ground for the older, more inefficient vehicles, dirtier vehicles that are being run out as the last line of production from factories who have nowhere else to go except to developing nations who obviously target the cheapest cars possible. Australian motorists have deeper pockets than just about every other country that doesn't have pollution caps, so we'll be a dumping ground for that vehicle. That's a difficult argument, I think, to make politically. While there is a cost of living crisis, no one wants to pay more than they need to for a car. But at the same time, Australians have shown, in the 2022 federal election, they're keen to promote climate policy and reduce emissions as well. So it's going to be a really interesting debate to watch.
Thank you so much, Mike, for your time.
Thanks, Sam.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Tammy Mills, with technical assistance by David McMillan. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.